Hey guys, today we are going to look at another one of Jesus' obscure parables, this time from Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 6. And I have to admit that out of all the parables that Jesus tells, my wife tells me she likes this one the least. And here's why. You can read the story by yourself, but it goes a little bit something like this. It says, the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who goes out and he hires laborers to work in his field or his vineyard. And he agrees to pay them a denarius for a full day's labor. Later in the day, he goes out and he sees some people standing around and he says, "What are you doing?" And they're like, "Well, no one's hired us." And he says, "Well, go work in my field and I'll pay you whatever I think is right." So they go. He goes again later in the day. And he does the same thing. And finally he goes at the very end of the day when there's 1 hour of work left and he finds some people still standing around idle. And he says, "Go and work in my field and I'll pay you whatever I think is right." And so they all go and work at different times for different periods of time doing the same job. And then eventually at the end of the day they come back to him and his manager in order to get paid. And first, the landowner calls out the people who worked last, the least amount. They worked an hour, and they get paid a whole denarius, which is a whole day's wage. And eventually, the next group and the next group, and then the first group, the people that worked from the beginning of the day come, and they also get a denarius. They then complain to the landowner, and they're like, "How is this right? Like, we worked for you all day long in the sun. We did the most work, and those people only work for an hour over there, and you're paying them the exact same that you're paying me." And the landowner's response is basically saying that, "Didn't you know? You agreed to work for me for this amount of wage. That's the definition of fairness. And whatever I agreed to pay these guys, that's up to me." And that's the end of the story. It's a really strange story. My wife doesn't like it because she thinks, well, it's not fair, right? Even though those guys agreed to work for, at the beginning of the day, worked for a whole denarius, that it's not fair that the people who only showed up for an hour, who didn't have to work out in the sun and in the sweat and heat, got the same amount. And that's what the story is really all about. Again, there are a number of ways that people have interpreted this parable. Some people interpret it quite literally in talking about your job, that as you look at your job and maybe you look around at people around you in your church community and you think, how is it fair that they do the same amount of work as me, or I maybe even do more work than them, but they get paid the same amount or more than I do? And so some people have interpreted this parable to simply be about learning to be thankful for what you have and not compare yourself to others. That it's a parable about covetousness or greed or wanting to or jealousy. Other people have it interpreted in a number of other ways. You substitute the idea of how we view work to how we view race or gender or ability or whatever, right? We look at someone else who has, greater abilities than us, and we're like, how is that fair or something? But I think the clue here is in Jesus's last line in the parable where he says, "The last will be first and the first will be last." This gets used in the parable that comes right before it in Matthew chapter 19 as well, and Jesus uses it in several other places where he talks about how life works and how the economy works in the kingdom of God. And the emphasis behind all of these statements is that whatever you think is right and fair and just, well, God works a bit differently than that. So, in this parable, for example, the people who showed up first, they agreed to work for a whole day for 1 denarius. That's what they agreed to. It's like they signed a contract. But the other people, if you notice in the story, it never says, the guy never says what he's going to pay them. He just simply says, "I'll pay you for whatever I think is right." Then at the end of the day, he decides that whatever is right is a full day's worth of pay. And the emphasis on here is the boss's, the landowner's response to these people who are jealous and upset. And he says, isn't it my money in my vineyard? Don't I have, you agreed to this amount, and don't I have the right to do whatever I want with my own money and pay people how I want to pay them? The emphasis is on the generosity of the landowner, that he can do. He's the one who defines what is good, what is not good, what is right, what is fair. He's the one who does it. That the people who are working, well, they agreed to something, but they have no rights whatsoever to decide what's right and fair other than what they had already previously agreed to. It's not up to them to look at other people and determine what their fate should be. It's the landowner's. He is the one in total control. Now, if you unpack this throughout the story, you see the emphasis on these people who are standing around doing nothing. Several times in the story, the landowner comes and he approaches these people and he's like, why are you standing around idle? And they say, well, no one has hired us. Back then, in this society, and you see this in, I've seen this in the U.S., and I'm sure it happens out in farms here with foreign workers as well, that there are people who don't have regular employment. And so often they will have just stood around at a normal meeting place and hoped that someone like this landowner would show up and offer them work for the day. In other words, they had no other source of income, no other source of work or employment for themselves. They were totally dependent on someone else to show up and offer them a job. And every single person in the story, even the first people that get hired, are in the same position. That they have no sort of status, they have no sort of rights, they have no sort of privileges of themselves. They're completely dependent on a landowner coming along and offering them work. And what I think the point of this parable is saying is that we are in the same position when it comes to us and our relationship with God. That we are totally unable to approach God with demands saying this is what we think is right and fair, and this is how you should operate. Because we are like in the position of these workers, that there's nothing in and of ourselves that can earn us anything, right? We are totally dependent on someone else to come by and show us mercy and grace and generosity, just like God. And so the point of this story is that the emphasis is on God's generosity, not human definition of what is right and fair. When we approach God thinking that we can sort of make demands to say, God, this is how you ought to operate, well, we have no position to really bargain from. We are sinful, broken people in front of a holy God. It's not possible. And so the emphasis is on, however you want to interpret what it means, that the point is that God is a crazy generous God, that we don't deserve anything, and yet God lavishes his love and riches onto us.